Okay, hello everyone. Simon Jacobson here. Welcome. Mazel tov to Elliot and Raquel upon your recent marriage. And may you have what we call in Judaism a binyan adiyad, which is an eternal edifice, a double eternal adiyad, and much nachas and bring joy to the Jewish people and to the entire world. Okay. Yeah. Or as they say, the topic this class is loneliness. Does someone care about you? So I guess when a couple gets married, officially they're not lonely anymore. But as some of the singers tell us, sometimes you just drink a cup called loneliness together. Let's be lonely together. I think Leonard Cohen put it that way. So two lonely people choose to be lonely together. I mean, that's a little depressing. So that's not really... I just said it like a tongue-in-cheek. But it's a good question. Are we really alone in this world? Even if you have faith in God, it still doesn't mean you don't feel alone, because God has concealed himself quite well. And as Christopher Hitchens, our resident atheist who passed away a few years ago, he wrote the book God is Not Great. So he said, when they asked him, discovered that he was Jewish, of course, his mother was Jewish. I mean, there's no atheists like Jews. Remember that always. No one can be an atheist like someone who believes, Those are the best atheists. So they asked him a little while after he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. They asked him, so what does he do if he finds out, he comes up to heaven, that there is a God? So his answer, which gives as a giveaway that he's Jewish, was that he will ask God, why did you conceal yourself so well? Basically. Which really echoes what the Arizal, the Holy Arizal, who revealed, or some say was Mechadish, he innovated what was called the secret of the Tzimtzum doctrine. Tzimtzum is a Hebrew word, and in the book, the classic work, Eitz Chaim, the Arizal didn't write most of his work, almost none of his work. It was written by his student, Rab Chaim Vital. So Eitz Chaim, one of the classics right in the beginning, and Eitzus Chaim and Maveh Sharim and some of his fundamental works, he develops, and something which is already alluded to in the Zohar and even in the Bible itself, the great Tzimtzum, which means the great concealment, which of course answers many philosophical and theological quandaries and questions of, and above all, if God is omnipresent, how come no one feels God's presence? And it's so easy to live an agnostic life and to deny God. And the answer that he gives, among other answers, is that God himself has the power to conceal himself. And just as the divine omnipresence is infinitely omnipresent, he also has the power to conceal himself with the same intensity. Hein gvurosav is the expression. With the same intensity that he can reveal himself, he could conceal himself. A simple example would be a wise person can choose to speak and can choose to be silent. And actually to be silent takes probably more energy and effort than to speak. So God exerted that type of energy, kavyachal as they say, so to speak, to conceal his presence, because that's the only way that an existence like ours could exist. If divine omnipresence would be complete and conscious and revealed, how could anything exist in that environment? Which is the words of the Arizal goes like this. He says that Ein Sof Hayim Amala Kol HaMetzius, the infinite divine light filled all of existence, and Lo Hayim Mokum, there was no space, not even potential space for anything but the divine, because the divine unity is omnipresent, it's omnipotent, it's omni in every possible way. There's no room for anything else. So philosophers and chakrim, Jewish thinkers and philosophers and theologians throughout history have always puzzled by this concept. So usually it was just dismissed as something we just don't understand. But the Arizal put it into some type of at least quantifiable terms, which is part of what God revealed to us, his power to conceal, which also is a relationship. When you know that God's concealing himself, that's also a relationship, because there's a power here. Just like when we look at a black hole, a havdil I should say, to separate. Even though no one can see a black hole, but we know that it's there because we see the effect it has on everything around it. So black hole, as you know, is the gravitational pull of that star and body is so powerful it doesn't even allow light to escape. So if it doesn't allow light to escape, how do we know it's there? But when you start seeing the bodies around it, when you start seeing strange movements or effects, it would be just like if you saw the metal in this room begin to move, you know there must be a powerful magnet somewhere behind the wall or somewhere, because even though you can't directly see it, but you see it from its effect. So bottom line is, that's also a relationship, and indeed, actually, a black hole, as we know, is even more powerful than a bright star. So in a sense, God's concealment has more divine power in a way than God's revelation, which itself is a pretty fascinating topic, and somewhat connected to what we're going to speak about. But I only began by saying that because in a sense, even when someone has God in their life, loneliness is part of this concealment. Because when you want to have a relationship with someone, you don't want just a relationship from a distance or concealed. Even if you're absolutely sure that the person you love is there, but you can't see them, it's still not a full relationship. So there's something about the concealment that creates a state of existential loneliness. So I'm going to address this topic and what that means. And the reason I'm speaking about it today is because we're now in the beginning of what's called the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks is considered the saddest time in the Jewish calendar. We don't do weddings then. For the reason being that 5 sad, major, tragic events took place this past 17th of Tammuz, which was this past Shabbos, and 5 tragic events took place 3 weeks later, which will be Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, 3 weeks from the last Shabbos. And of course, the major event that is most famous and most known is the destruction of the temple, which began 3 weeks earlier with the breaching of the wall around Jerusalem, which I discussed last week somewhat. And then 3 weeks later, the destruction, the actual burning down of the temple, first by the Babylonians, Temple 1, first temple, and 490 years later, the Romans destroyed the second temple. And ever since, we have no temple. We have now a Temple Mount, which is a sacred ground, and they're still fighting over it. And we have the Kosel HaMaravi, the western wall, which is the outer wall of that second temple that Herod built. So it's the outer wall. It's not even the wall of the actual temple. It's the wall that was around the temple. It was another wall around the whole area. So that's just to give you the geographical location. And as the Maimonides says, Kedusha le'zazim imkema, holiness never is a permanent and an eternal thing. So the space has physical space has holiness, even though we don't have the actual temple. But because the divine presence was there, and in a manifest way, till this day and forever, it's always considered a sacred ground. Just like all of Israel is considered sacred, but this has a special level of sanctity, which is why we don't walk on the Temple Mount, and we cherish it, and we consider it to be holy until the third temple will be rebuilt there. So these 3 weeks, besides these events, there are other events. For example, the breaking of the tablets happened on the 17th of Tammuz, and the Mishnah in the end of the chapter, the Tractate Tainus, enumerates what exactly happened. And Tisha B'Av too were sad events, beginning with actually when the scouts came back from Israel with a bad report, was also on Tisha B'Av. So suffice it to say that it's negative energy. Negative energy in Kabbalistic terminology is tzimtzum energy, which means darkness, concealment. It doesn't mean God is not there. It means that consciously it's harder to see, or sometimes even most difficult to see. And the way we understand these things, especially from a mystical, Kabbalistic perspective, this isn't just an event that happened thousands of years ago, 1948 years ago to be precise, regarding the second temple, but because it's a concealment and time is a cycle, is like a spiral, it reoccurs every year at this time. Just like we honor a birthday, or we honor Rosh Hashanah, not just commemorating events that happened back then, but it's actually, as the Arizal also says, Hayomim ha'ela nizkarim v'nasim, which means that time is not a linear thing. Time is not like a river of time, a line. It's a spiral. So every year, that same time, the energy that existed the first time repeats itself. That's why our birthdays are not just commemoration. They're actually a reenactment of the moment you were born. Once a year, it returns to that spot. And that's how every holiday is understood. Passover, and Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, and Shavuos, and so on. So the 3 weeks is essentially, you can say, is in time. Essentially, every year, this reflects all the negative things that have happened in history. In a way, somewhat, the vortex of it is like the archetype of it is during this period of time. So it's not just we're remembering events that happened, everything, including the Holocaust, and including the pogroms, and including all the dark moments collectively that Jews experienced, suffered, or individually, is in a way the 3 weeks is not just symbolic, the 3 weeks is that dark energy. But as I pointed out before, dark energy in Judaism, there's no such thing as an apocalypse, there's no such thing as doom, there's no such thing as a dead end. Everything is going toward a better place. Now sometimes you see it directly, and you climb the steps and you see that you're going to a better place, and sometimes you don't see it. But that doesn't mean it's not happening. Everything is a metamorphosis. So even the darkest moments, and we'll talk about this as we get closer to Tisha B'Av, it's the saddest day of the year. In the afternoon is when Mashiach is born. Of all times, when the flames were highest, and as the temple was burning, that's when the Messiah was born. That's what the Medrash tells us, which emphasizes that the darkest moments have the most energy, but they're inverted energy, like the black hole. It's the deepest level of concealment, but we see it as power. But we want the power, obviously, to be not inverted, but outverted. I don't know if that's a word. Expressed instead of imploding, exploding in a positive way. So we'll talk about that some more. It's not really the topic, but it's somewhat connected. So in a sense, when you try to translate this so-called dark energy, if you wouldn't want to put it that way, the shadows, this concealment, how do you translate that in psychological language? So one of the key words you use is loneliness. One of the human experiences where we feel and sense darkness, where we sense, is when we feel alone. We feel alone. It's not the only expression. You could also say when one's depressed, when one is even angry. All negative vices, all human vices are somewhat connected to dark energy. But I'm going to focus on loneliness specifically because when you open up the book of Lamentations, which is where Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah the prophet, documents the saddest events that he witnessed in the destruction of the first temple. So he begins and opens it. This is the book we read on the night of Tisha B'Av. So Mashiach even Mashiach does come. It's a holy book. It's considered one of the Chavdalah, the 24 holy books. But it's a book of Lamentations. It's a book of sad book. Eicha it's called. The book of Eicha. We read it this year. We'll read it Saturday night. Because Shabbos so-called suspends Tisha B'Av. But Saturday night, after the Shabbos, begins the fast. And that's when that evening we'll be reading Eicha. Some people read it again the next day. But regardless, Lamentations. So how does it open up? And I've talked about this many times. It opens up, interestingly, with loneliness. That's the first thing Jeremiah describes, the loneliness of the she. He says, Eicha yashva badat. Woe, alas. How do you translate Eicha? Woe or alas, she sits alone. Yashva badat. And who's the she? He's referring to Jerusalem, that the city of Jerusalem sits alone, which is, of course, in the wake of the devastation and the destruction of the temple. So Jerusalem is now alone. Its dwellers were exiled or killed. The temple was destroyed. Jerusalem lay in ruins. So Jeremiah talks about the city like it was a human being. She sits alone. Loneliness. Now, of all things, that's how he opens up this book of Lamentations. Now we had the destruction of the temple is one of the worst possible things in history. Is the temple was where the Shekhinah, the divine presence, rested, where divine presence was experienced in the Holy of Holies on a daily basis in many different ways. It was the channel, the interface. Zeh Shara Shamayim, the interface between heaven and earth. And this Jeremiah doesn't feel he should open with that. Many people were killed, hundreds of thousands of people, whatever the numbers are. The beginning of the bitter exile began. All that is not the opening. This loneliness is what bothers him most. When you open up something, it's usually open with the most dramatic element. Now, it's not that he's dismissing the other things. They come, trust me, there's plenty, he talks about it all, of what happened during that period in time. But the fact that he opens with Badod, the loneliness, tells you and indicates that he's personalizing it. because loneliness is a sensation, a feeling we all can relate to. Someone asked me what the class was. Someone asked me earlier, what's the topics? I said loneliness. Immediately the person says, "Oh, I can relate to that." And I told her that, unfortunately, many people say that. Got an email today as well. "Oh, I can't wait to hear what you have to say about this." Because at the end of the day, all of us have either experienced it or are experiencing it presently. And we know it's a very difficult state of being to feel lonely. And even those of us that may not sense it all the time, you start thinking about it, you start thinking, maybe I am lonelier than I think I am. Maybe I'm just distracting myself and keeping myself busy. Because at the end of the day, whatever we are busy with, even if people love us, and even if people are involved with us, you walk home alone. Even if you have a loving spouse and you have a loving family, there's a part of us deep inside that really, sometimes you feel nobody can really get, nobody really relates to, nobody can really understand. And especially if we've been hurt in life, that's especially the areas where we think we're unique and nobody can ever really get the pain I've been through or the difficulties I've experienced. So loneliness is this, you can say even ever present, but it definitely lies not deep, not far from the surface of many of our experiences. Now, when things are going well and people are celebrating and people are partying, you usually don't feel it because you're feeling good about yourself. But when things are not going well, that's when we become that sense of isolation. And does anyone really care? When you're riding high and people need you and they feel that you can do them a favor, they usually line up, they're around. When suddenly people feel that you can't help them anymore, you come to realize, who are my real friends? And many people will mention this. They'll say, when things are good, I can't really know who my real friends are. The question is when I'm in a place where I need help, and now that I can help them, how many people are really loyal? So I'm not want to depress anyone, both here or online, but these are the realities, and I'm just saying it as a method of observation. Obviously, my intention is to address it, not just to state it and go home. The point here is to discuss this. But the first thing you should know and feel consoled, that starting from Jeremiah, and the Torah in general, this is a theme, it's discussed. It's not something we ignore. It's very often you go to a class or you read a book, you find people talk about experiences that are pleasant. Most people don't like to talk about things that are unpleasant. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable. But the first thing the Torah is a book of truth, Torah Emes. And just as it talks about positive things, it's very blunt and candid about negative things. It does not mince words. You open up a Bible, you'd be surprised that it's not packaged. There's no spin. You say things exactly as they are, the naked truth, and without gloves. And sometimes it's disturbing, actually. Because if you start reading it, I remember years ago, I grew up with learning Torah all the time, so you take for granted certain things. But I remember someone coming to this class, and the first time he ever heard of the word Torah, and he started reading it every week. So for him, it was like a novel, it was like a novelty, a new thing. And I remember coming to me like week after week with more shock and more shock. He says, this is a really terrible stories in this book. Nobody seems to get along. Everybody's killing each other. Families are dysfunctional. It starts with Adam and Eve. Cain kills Hevel. Then you have the story with the sins, the next generations. Then the stories with the children of Noach, and they castrate their father or whatever it is that they do. They shame him. And then you have the story with, then starts Abraham and he has Ishmael and Isaac. They don't get along. And then you have Isaac and he doesn't get along. He has two children with Rebekah, Jacob and Esau, and they don't get along, even in pregnancy. And the list goes on. Even when Jacob finally builds a family, you say, finally, a healthy, functional family. What do you think? The brothers get jealous of their brother, Joseph. They want to kill him. They end up selling him into slavery. There's not one family story in the Bible that is intact, And I'm not saying it to be humorous. I'm stating what it says. So he was like really disturbed. He thought he's reading the Bible. He's going to find a book that makes him feel nice when he goes to sleep, soothing. He says, I can't go to sleep with these stories. If you really take them seriously, they're like nightmares. Just imagining Cain, how he killed Hevel, his own brother, and then he tries to bury him and hide him, etc., etc. And then, as the story evolves, you could think it's going to get better and better, right? At some point, every movie has a happy ending. People don't like bad endings. And the Bible doesn't get better. Things get worse. There's plenty of beautiful things. I'm not dismissing that, and he didn't dismiss it either, but he was like sharing with me, and I realized, to me, I just take it for granted. That's the story. Every year we read it, and then we go on. Okay, finally the Jews leave Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, and he was convinced. I remember him telling me, I can't wait to hear the end of the story. They finally enter the promised land. And he was like so disturbed when he found out they never enter the promised land. He thought the last line, they entered. No, right by the river Jordan, and they all die there, including Moses. And it's only in the next book in Joshua, which is already not even the 5 books anymore, you hear that story. So, I mean, he didn't challenge me, but he was saying, what's going on? So, what came to me immediately was, the Torah is not here to make you feel good. The Torah is telling you what life is like. This is life. Life is absurd. Life doesn't make sense. Here the Jews have all the blessings and favors God does for them, and they still complain. Not once, and not twice, and 10 times, and again, and again, and again. They don't like the water, then they don't like the water, then they don't like the meat, then they don't like the man, and they don't like everything is a problem. And they don't like Moses, they don't like the promised land. I'm not going to do a Jackie Mason piece, but you get the idea. So, but on the other hand, it's reflective of life. Look at your life. You tell me, is your life predictable? Is your life consistent? God is good to you. Do you suddenly say, oh, thank you? Or you always find something to complain about? So the Torah is very honest and very direct because it's meant to be a blueprint for life. And life is complicated. Not getting into now the deeper meaning behind the stories. Obviously the stories are more than just what meets the eye, and every story has a deeper meaning. Of course, Joseph's brothers were great people. And Joseph and them selling Joseph was not just mere jealousy. But that's already, you need to have explanation. I'm talking on the surface level. So to get back to our theme, the Torah talks about loneliness. So you'll say, well, how does it help you if he talks about it? Because you know something? We know today in therapy, they say silence, break the silence. Speaking about something that has a healing element to it. Because the secondary so-called collateral effects and damage of any so-called bad, negative feelings is, you know what? Is when you have to hide it. What do they say? The silence is worse than the rape. When a person, something happens, there's a travesty or some type of violation. So it's one thing, that's bad enough. But then if you're told it never happened, what are you talking about? And it's minimized. That's in many ways far worse than the original crime. Because what that does, that covers it up, makes believe, it even invalidates your feeling. You can't even cry. I can't tell you how many times I've cried and heard the story of children who were hurt by their parents, and then their parents said, nothing happened, smile. And they hated the photo ops during holiday seasons and so on because the fake face everyone put on when they were crying inside. I remember one person telling me how she was abused terribly, and Friday night they kept Shabbos, the family. And when she would sit in her bedroom crying, her father, who was the abuser, would tell his children, sing louder to drown out her tears, her cries. So that in many ways is far worse than the crime. Because that's like taking the knife and making believe that nothing happened. Which then there's no even room for healing. It's like you'd go to a doctor and you have a terrible wound, God forbid, an infection. The doctor said, no problem, there's no problem. You're imagining it. Then what happens? The infection festers and grows to a point that becomes something you can't even end up fixing. You nip a problem in the bud, you can solve almost any problem. But when it becomes something that you cover up, and it's minimized and invalidated, and we're not even allowed to express our feelings about it, that's serious. That's far, far deeper problem. Which is why I submit that the Torah talks about things very openly. Because it's not about this exactly what happened. Cain killed Hevel, yes. The brothers sold Joseph into slavery, and this is the beginning. Yedias hamachla, chetzi refuah. Awareness of a problem, awareness of the illness is half the cure. And this is the first statement in any type of illness, even physical illness, definitely psychological. Psychological problems, and person says, there's no problem. You hear couples fighting with each other, and one of them says, there's no big thing. That is the worst thing at all, because there's no one to talk to. The person doesn't even think there's a problem. And I'm sure we've all encountered things like that. So even though you could say, well, just because you told me that loneliness is something that we're talking about and everybody has it in some way, does that get rid of the problem? No, but it's the beginning of a discussion. At least we can talk about it. Which is in a way when you say that the Rizal spoke about the Tzimtzum, the mere fact that he put into words that there's a darkness of this nature, a concealment, in many ways it's somewhat consoling. It's somewhat soothing to hear. Because then you say, you know what, I'm not crazy. The fact that I can't feel God, even though I believe in God, the fact that I can't sense it, there's a reason for that. The analogy given in some Hasidic texts is the analogy of a parent who hides from his or her child in order to elicit the ingenuity of the child to find the parent. This is a mashal, this is an analogy given from the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid of Mezrich, and the different Hasidic masters. But then what happens is, and here's the real sad part, the child stops looking. The parent has hidden himself so well. The child searches, and then at some point says, maybe there's no parent, maybe there's no one around. And time passes, and the whole point of the concealment was in order to elicit the ingenuity and intelligence to find the parent, and that turns on the head. It's turned on its head, and it becomes an end in itself because the child has stopped seeking. Which is why in Judaism so much the concept of Dirsha Hashem b'motzei, Bakshu Ponai, the idea of asking, beseeching. We cry out to God in our prayers, show your face, Yivrech Hashem Shmerech, Yoras Hashem Panecha V'choneka. Many phrases, hundreds of phrases where we say to God, reveal yourself, show your face. Because it's like demonstrating that we do not accept the status quo, the concealment as healthy. So the mere fact that a person, and as Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu express and bemoans the fact that Jerusalem sits alone, that itself is the beginning of the healing. I'm not going to accept this as good and healthy. I'm not going to accept the status quo as fine. In the olden days, before there was air conditioning, and there was heat like this, I don't know if it was heat like this, but there was definitely heat. Maybe the industrialization has made the heat and the humidity stronger, but whatever. So in the olden days, what they do to relieve themselves of a hot day, they went into a basement, a cellar that was cooler, it was beneath the ground, and it was cool. However, there was no electricity in those days. So there was also no light. So if you went to cool yourself, you also were in darkness. So one chassid, trying to find some relief from a terribly hot day in Russia, finds some cellar, goes into it, and it comes down the steps into the cellar. He says, so dark here. And one of the people sitting there, has been there for a while, says, don't worry, you'll get used to it soon. And the chassid replied, that's exactly what I'm worried about, that I'll get used to it. So there's an expression, Som cheshech le'er umar l'mosek. There are those that call darkness light and sweet and bitter sweet. If you read 1984, George Orwell puts it very well. War is peace. Peace is war. Where the whole brain, what was it called already? I forgot already, the language that they made up then, Big Brother. I read the book so long ago, I can't even remember. So they had this language. They literally brainwashed you and programmed you to start saying that good is bad and bad is good. So it's one thing when you know there's a problem. Like I said before, you're aware. It's far, far worse when you don't think it's a problem. When you think not only it's not a problem, you think the problem is the solution. I remember once hearing this from my Rebbe, the Rebbe, Lubavitcher Rebbe. I don't remember when it was. He said, in a Farbrengen once, he said, everybody has flaws, but don't make a philosophy out of them. You know, once you make a philosophy out of your flaws, then you're already giving it legitimacy. Then a little time passes, and you know what? Hey, this is cool. It's another option. Illness is an option. God forbid. So the Baal Shem Tov puts it, Haster Aster Panai. When we say God conceals his face, but he says a double concealment. Haster Aster Panai. B'yemahu. In that fateful day, that Hahu, Loshanista, which means we say that in that day, not today, not in any revealed way, in that day, that sad day, God conceals his face. So the Baal Shem Tov asks, what's this double concealment? It's because there's two types of concealment. One is dark, And you know it's dark. Like right now it's dark outside. We know the morning, the light, the dawn will break and the sun will rise. And then there's a darkness that conceals the fact that it's dark. That's the double Hester. You say it's not dark, it's light. You're miserable. I'm not miserable. It's great. Which then, as I said before, that creates problems that are far, far worse, because now you don't even have tools to work with. Perception, your standards. You don't even know, is it a problem, is it not a problem? Someone says it's not a problem, how could you solve a non-problem when it is a problem? So the fact that we cry out and we say loneliness is not acceptable, and the fact that I feel alone, isolated, is not what I want, and you never accept that as a healthy feeling, that is the beginning of the solution, because it means you're going to do something about it. And that's what I'm going to address. What are you going to do about it? But if you don't have this first step, if you accept it, and your standards, you start lowering your standards, and you start accepting whatever's going on in your life as being fine, even the problems, what do you think is going to happen? Your threshold for pain will lower. You'll become immune and numb to growing. How many of us do that as we get older? We start lowering our standards, I had high standards, very idealistic, but then as things didn't work out, instead of me feeling miserable all day, you start just lowering your expectations to the point where I have people tell me, if I get through a day and I didn't get beat up, that to me is a successful day. And I say, well, in business you'd also say the same thing. That if you made no profits and you didn't lose anything, you're also successful. Because remember, the day passed, and if you didn't make money, it means you lost money. Because a day of time, and time has passed, that time is money. Zovin tagri ikre, which means if someone who just deals and invests $100 and gains $100, that's not a business person. Also on a personal level. But what happens is, as I said, when we get disappointed, and we get hurt, our expectations lower. And the Torah sees that as being unacceptable. You can never lower your expectations. This doesn't mean you have to beat a dead horse, and mean that you have to try to do things that are just not possible. But it means you can't lower the expectations, because if you give up on yourself, and you give up on your soul, and you give up on God giving you the power to deal with situations, how will you ever get out of it? And that I find to be one of the greatest challenges. That people don't believe that they can improve. Their situation can improve. And if you don't believe it, how can anyone do it for you? So the first step is to instill in someone the confidence that no, you may have given up on yourself because you are weak, but you have a soul, and your soul is divine, and there's a God in there somewhere. And even in this great symptom, as dark as it gets, there's something powerful there. If someone doesn't have that feeling and sense of hope and promise, it's very, very hard to do anything, because you can't work with someone who doesn't believe in themselves. So, of course, the challenge is, how do you teach them? That's why it's so vital to understand what our soul is like, and understand that all the circumstances we're in, even if they seem dire and difficult, is not who you are. That's what you're going through. It's very different than saying that I've suffered and saying I'm a sufferer. You could say I've experienced setbacks, but it doesn't mean you are a setback. I may have some experience, some disappointments, but you're not a disappointment. It's not about you. But that's what happens. What happens is our experiences we start identifying with our experiences, and we identify that our identity becomes a product of our circumstances. So that separation, to know that there's what you are and what you experience are two separate things. Then you have the beginning of healing. So let's take loneliness as an example. You may feel lonely, but is your inherent state of being a lonely person or not? The first thing, you need to be humble enough to say, maybe not, I don't know. When people say, I know everything about myself, and I know that I'm fundamentally a lonely person, that's a very arrogant statement. You could say you feel lonely. You could say I experience loneliness, and I don't know of another alternative. But you can't define yourself because you didn't create yourself. How do you know what you're capable of? So the first thing is have the humility to know that you don't have it all figured out, especially about yourself. Because we have blind spots and we're subjective, and our life experiences do shape us. And often they turn us into thinking that what we experience has become us. So distinguishing between the two is critical. So even that sad line, Eicha Yashva Badat, woe, alas, she sits alone. Yirmiyahu is saying right away, loneliness is not a positive thing, and Jerusalem doesn't deserve to be alone. That's why I'm bemoaning it. That's why I'm crying over it. And I'm not going to accept it as it's all fine and good. It's not fine and good. So that's the first thing to understand, that the states, the experiences we go through in life are not defining factors of who we are. They are descriptions of our experiences, but they don't define who you are. Okay, that's number one. Number two is, so then what exactly do you do with this thing called loneliness? And in truth, are we really alone? Are we not alone? So let's talk about that for a moment. Just like a flower needs moisture for it to blossom, and if it doesn't have it, it will wither, it will wilt. The same is true with the spirit of a human being. We all need love, and the idea that someone cares about you and feels for you is a way of like watering a parched soul. And that's what allows us to flourish, allows us to blossom, allows us to grow. Which is why, in a healthy environment, children growing up in a loving home, besides the mere thing that love is a beautiful thing, it's more than that. Love is sustenance. Just as they need food and drink, even more so they need that reassurance, the confidence, the validation. Because we live in a hostile world, and as children will grow into adults, they're going to go into a world that does not care about them. There'll be people who are predators. There'll be people who are exploiters. People who are not even maliciously, will always think in terms of, what are you doing for me? That type of unconditional acceptance and care is what every human being deserves. And what we deserve first and foremost is getting from our parents. Now, unfortunately, when parents don't offer that, then it's one of the worst possible crimes. Because it's literally not allowing the flower to be watered in those critical formative years. In worst extreme situations, it's when there's real abuse, so it really does a lot of damage. But even then, as I said before, it does damage to your outer layers. It never really impacts who you are, except it impacts who you think you are. Which is why the work to heal from that, and I'm using specifically and deliberately a very extreme example, because extreme examples help us understand things even in more milder situations, is that even those extreme examples, and I've seen it with my own eyes, people who learn to transcend and grow and realize that what happened to me, even horrible things, is not who I am, and they come to realize and find ways to nurture themselves, even if they were not nurtured. So it comes to a physical flower, God forbid, if you don't water it, it will die. When it comes to the human soul, it doesn't die, it withers. It's weak, and it may feel like it's dying, but you could revive it, you could rejuvenate it by teaching someone to find a way to nurture themselves, or to find a way to get nurtured through others, even if they were deprived. Now, obviously, it's far, far easier if you get it at home from a young age, but it's not an impossibility. It's not like it's doomsday if a person doesn't get it, just for the record. So essentially, when children, if you observe children, you see the way they bond, the way they connect with their mothers, with their fathers. It's a type of touch, physical touch, it's validation, it's encouragement. Every little step of the way, healthy parents are excited about the first step a child takes, the first words they utter, the first time they do this, they do that, to the point it even looks silly to an outsider sometimes. But that does more power in shaping this child's confidence than anything in life. Because the child is learning for the first time that it's valuable, that I'm valuable, that I'm precious, I'm cherished by my parent. And that's water to the soul. That's water to the identity of this child. And it's nourishing and cultivating and brings out the best in every human being. Now, a person has that. Do they have loneliness? Of course, they will be always an individual as the child grows up and the umbilical cord will be cut more than once, metaphorically speaking. Obviously, there'll be an element where a child will be different than their parent. And there's a point in our awkward adolescence and then young teens and older teens, and you go and become an adult, there are going to be a stage where everyone goes through what Kabbalah calls yesh, ayin, yesh. That before you become an adult, you have to go through some form of void and vacuum. We all will go through a state of confusion. Just like creativity is a child of frustration. So too, growth into any metamorphosis, into growing into an adult, will go through a state where you're learning to become separate from your parents and your family structure and your community and society and friends, to become your own self. But if you've had that nurturing, you've got a good head start. You've got the arsenal. You have a resources, a whole tool chest of validation of a flower that has that confidence. So therefore, even when you start dealing with the so-called existential loneliness of life, you're not coming unarmed. You're not coming unprepared. You're very well prepared because confidence was instilled in you from the young age. That still doesn't mean, and very important to point out, that does not mean there will be no loneliness. Because if that's the case, you'd say, hey, let's take a theoretical, perfect situation. The best possible parents, even if it's not realistic, but the best possible parents did all the possible nurturing. Will that child never have loneliness? No, of course they'll have loneliness. Because they're going to grow up to be an adult and they have a unique personality and they won't always be understood by others. Even their parents they may be alienated from. Even if there's a loving relationship, alienated because you don't understand me, I have a different way of looking at it. Whatever it is that we need as we grow independent. But that person will have the tools to deal with the loneliness. As I said before, the issue is not to eliminate these challenging feelings, it's to realize that that doesn't define you, and realize, number two, that you can do something about it. As I always mention about a good swimmer. A good swimmer is not someone who can swim under all circumstances. A good swimmer knows how to navigate. And if there's a storm and there's a tide that's very strong, a bad swimmer will try to fight the tide till they get exhausted. And a good swimmer will just float, will just go with the flow. So it's about navigating. It's not about perfection. It's about learning how to navigate the ups and downs of life. There's no person on earth that's not going to experience one disappointment, at least, if not more, in life. The difference between one and the other is what you do about it when you face it. Do you know how to navigate it, or does it destroy you, or does it demoralize you? So the one that has that confidence will know what to do with the loneliness. And the one that doesn't, the loneliness can become overwhelming and suddenly define you to the point that it can completely demoralize and undermine who you are. So with that said then, so how does a healthy person deal with loneliness? How does a person, there's two lonely people, and one person is depressed and despair, doesn't want to go out of the house. They feel lonely, they feel alone, nobody cares about me. And another person also feels alone, but they're healthy. What's the difference between how a healthy person does deal with loneliness and an unhealthy person deals with loneliness? It's a good question, right? The same thing you could ask, by the way, about anything. How does a healthy person deal with a loss, with trauma, with death, God forbid, with anger? And that's the key. Study people who are healthy, you'll see it's not that they don't have these experiences, they just know how to deal with it. They know how to navigate through it. So I discussed this, as you reminded me, last year and a number of years ago. There's another place in the Torah that talks about the same word bodad, but it's used in a completely positive context. When Yirmiyahu says Eicha Yashva Badad, he's saying, whoa, Eicha. Woe or alas, in a negative way, that she sits alone, desolate, alone, isolated, like someone, God forbid, sitting Shiva. After a death, they're alone. They feel they're alone. But there's the pasuk Hein Am Levaded Yishken that's used in actually last week's parsha. And then we have in the last book, in Devarim, where Moshe Rabbeinu says the expression, he talks about the Jewish people as bodod, what's the expression? Hashem bodod yanchenu, and there's Hein Am Levaded Yishken, which is also positive. Huh? Yeah. No, that's a negative. Yeah, that's Mitzera, right. Now, Mitzera is a negative, that's alone. So you have an expression, Hein Am Lo Yishkin, is where you talk about it's an exceptional nation, that they're unique. Because loneliness, if you turn it around, loneliness could also be the uniqueness of someone who doesn't find a parallel. They're alone in their uniqueness. And anyone who has special qualities, anyone who has a talent, has a certain element of loneliness, but we usually don't call it loneliness because you call it uniqueness. So when you say, for example, Mi ka'amchi Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz, it's an expression. The Talmud tells like this, that the mitzvahs that we perform, the good deeds we perform, God also performs. So, it's a mitzvah to put on tefillin every weekday. What does it say in our tefillin? It reminds us of God's unity. It reminds us that there's a God. We live in a world that, as I said, divine is concealed. So remember, there's a God, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And this God is the ultimate reality. Hashem Echad, the unique, ultimate reality. The only reality. Because Echad doesn't just mean one God and not many, it means one reality and not many. It's one reality. Everything is part of the divine unity. So then the question is asked, what does it say in God's tefillin? Because God doesn't need to be reminded that He exists. We need to be reminded because we live in the concealed world. We live in a world where the divine presence is concealed. So what does God's tefillin say? It's a good question, right? So it also says the word echad. God is reminding that Mi ka'amchi Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. Look at this nation of Israel, this singular nation that devoted its entire being to serve me and suffered for it as well. And interestingly, of all people, who recognize this most, it's anti-Semites. It's Haman. What does Haman say in the Megillah when he goes to Achashverosh? How does he describe this nation that he hates so much? He gives them the greatest compliment, like Bilam did last week, the prophet, that Lavad Yishkin gives them the greatest compliment. What does he say? He says, Yeshnai Am Echad. He's telling Achashverosh. One Jew hater is telling another Jew hater. The only question is which one was a bigger one. That there's Yeshna in this nation of yours, this empire of yours, 127 nations. There's one nation, Am Echad. He calls them Am Echad, one unique nation. Yeshna Am Echad Mefuzar Mefered Ben Amim. They're spread out among all your nations, among all your peoples. V'daseim shenis mikol am. And their faith, their religion is different than everybody's. Now, not that I like to quote, this is the Megillah, so it's another holy book, but I don't even like to admit that I read this, but reading Mein Kampf from Yimach Shemoy Hitler, he says almost the same words in German. I didn't read it in German, I read it in English. Now, I didn't read it from cover to cover, every word that can trust me, but I wanted to just see what he wrote. And he writes about the Jews in Vienna, where he lived. He says, I suddenly see this Jew. What is this Jew? Lives among us, but he's different than all of us. And you see I don't even want to repeat his venom. But he says almost what Haman, another guy with an H, said years earlier, recognizing something's unique about them. Now they see the uniqueness as obviously something that disturbs them deeply. As the Talmud speaks about this, how Achashverosh and Haman each saw the Jews differently. This one saw them as a pit, and this one saw them as a mound. But both of them saw them as a disturbing entity. And you hear this from all the anti-Semites. What is this different nation? Unique nation. So uniqueness can be seen in a positive way, it can be seen in a negative way, just like loneliness. So how does a healthy person look at loneliness? They look at loneliness as uniqueness. God is also lonely, because there's only one God. No one to talk to. Who's like he has no contemporary. So yes, we're told that because God traveled long, is looking for a partner, looking for someone to communicate with. This is why He created existence. But even after all that, it's still we're not equals. So God is probably the most lonely entity of all. Because even as we go off and wander off doing our own thing, we forget about the plan for which God created us. Can you imagine how lonely that is? How painful that is? God hides his presence, waiting for us to look for him, and then we forget about him. It's a pretty lonely experience. But you think God gets demoralized? No, because God is unique. Healthy loneliness is called uniqueness. It's like a person realizes that I have something special about me. Not arrogant, but special as you were chosen to do something that no one else but you can accomplish. And because you have that uniqueness, in some way you're going to have a certain measure of loneliness. Since only you can accomplish it, no one else can do it, so no one else can really identify with that part of you. But that should not demoralize us. Why? Because that's exactly what the point is. And you realize also that everybody around you also has something unique. So that's why two people can be lonely together in that way. What is lonely? They're not lonely, they're unique together. So talk about marriage, since you're a young, loving couple, So I'll just say the following, that the true love and true marriage is not that two people can communicate and understand each other on the deepest levels. There will always remain a mystique between two people, even the ones that love each other deeply. There's nothing wrong with mystique. There's nothing wrong with being vulnerable. There's nothing wrong with you don't have to have it all figured out. In business, in this material world, everybody wants to control everything. In love, truth, God, everything that's real, control is not a factor. So it's not about, I have to get it all. Like someone say, if you really love me, you have to tell me everything. That concept is ridiculous. There's certain things that just are not don't have to be said necessarily. And there's certain things that man and woman may never understand about each other. But that's the beauty of love. That though you don't understand, you still love the person. And on the contrary, if they were just you and you could understand them and they could understand you, what do we need two of you for? There's something, the uniqueness, you honor the uniqueness of another person by not having to always understand the details, because you're not them. But you still can respect them, because that's what means complementing each other. So when you think of take nature itself, take the human body. Can the mind ever really experience the heart? And can the heart really experience the mind? They're so different. The mind is a reflective and analytical machine. The heart is an emotional, impulsive entity. And the same with all the other parts of the body. And yet, what's a healthy body? That they all work in tandem. They all work so coordinated that you can't even distinguish. You don't say the body is a sum of its parts. It's one entity that has many components. They will just work together. Whenever you see projects that work really well, and people are secure and confident, and nobody's trying to take away something from someone else, and egos don't get in the way, what do you see? You see different unique people, each contributing their uniqueness and creating something, a synergy that's more than the sum of the parts. You see a symphony, an orchestra playing a symphony, 100-piece orchestra, and they're different instruments, and they play in different times, and they play different beats and different tempos, and it's all. But there is a beauty, the harmony of it is precisely because one is not the other, and because every one of them respects the other. So both being unique, at the same time realizing that the other uniqueness complements you, is the key. The only reason we humans don't get along with each other is because we have the free will to decide not to play the music together. And we start feeling, hey, maybe you took something away from me. Instead of appreciating that you are here because you have something unique, you start looking for someone else's uniqueness and say, maybe that's mine. Who was it? Philip, I think, told me, my friend Philip said, that he used to tell when he was a little kid and he would be complaining, he'd say to his grandmother, I wish, and she'd say, you have a good life, what's the matter? He says, I wish I was you. You know how children sometimes, I wish, they think that you have it good, the grass always looks greener on the other side. So his grandmother said to him, if you were me, who would be me? You know? If I were you, who would be me? What do they say? The story, the Chelem joke. The Chelem has these ridiculous jokes, but they're very insightful psychologically. So this guy, it's an identity crisis joke, right, with a thread. So he goes to the mikveh, goes to the ritual bath. And he's a guy that has a problem with his identity crisis, doesn't know who he is. So as he's getting undressed, about to go into the bath, he realizes since he identifies himself by his garments, once he's completely disrobed, how will he know who he is when he comes out of the water? So he decides to do something, which is not exactly halachic, but that's how the joke goes. He ties a red thread around his toe and says, so when I come out of the water, I'll look for the red thread so I'll know who I am. But God always has interesting plans. So God says, so what happens is he goes into the water, the thread gets loose, unties itself, and attaches itself to someone else's toe. Okay, he comes out of the bath, he's looking for the thread, he finds it on someone else's toe. And he says, I know who you are, but who am I? You know? So it's not one of these uproarious jokes that cause that type of laughter, but it's a key element because many of us, that's how we look to identify ourselves in context of others. And this often happens living in homes where parents are very dominating or very critical. So you never really develop your own comfort with your own identity, and you're always trying to be somebody else. Why aren't you like your brother? Why aren't you like your sister? Why aren't you like me? Why aren't you like this? Whether they say it or it's implied, whatever it is. And these things have effect. So you start forgetting who you are. You start trying to be somebody else. This is a common problem. We have plenty of such identity crisis today. So when it comes to that type of scenario, what happens is that a person loses touch with their own uniqueness. So the same word bodad that can be used in the sad, lonely sense can also be used in the context of a unique nation. A nation that sits alone in its uniqueness, has a unique job to accomplish. Now that doesn't make it easy necessarily, but it makes it powerful. And that's how a healthy person looks at loneliness. So even when they feel a sense or some type of sense of isolation, well, they'll turn it around as saying, okay, let me see how I can use that to be a springboard for motivating me to do something special and unique. And recognizing also that other people have that uniqueness as well. So loneliness is, on its own, on its surface level, can be a very, does not evoke, as I said, always positive feelings. I remember once in a Shabbaton, I was speaking about existential loneliness. And someone came over to me and said, do me a favor, please don't use that word. It's very depressing, because it makes you start thinking about that element of being alone. And I saw it actually as something that should help lift us up, because we all have that element. As a matter of fact, as I said before, in a way, it's a way of identifying with the God. The Medrash says that after the world was created, so 6 days God created the world, and 7 days Shabbos, right? So the Medrash says that everything in this world is divided in couples. So Sunday has Monday as a couple, Tuesday has Wednesday, Thursday has Friday. Some places it says Sunday has Friday, Monday has Thursday, and Tuesday has Wednesday. But regardless, the 6 are 3 couples. There's one lonely day alone. It's called Shabbos. So what do you do with this lonely soul, this single, this lonely heart's single? So God looks around and looks in the nations. The nations also have pairs, but there's one nation sits alone. So what do you do when you see 2 lonely singles? You put them together, right? So God takes Shabbos and puts it together with the Jewish people. He says, I'll give you Shabbos. So there you have now the final couple. So what does this mean exactly? Is this talking about play of words? Could have made 8 days a week. Not to rip off the words of the Beatles. But there's something, because the weekdays, there's a thing that needs to be in couples. And then there's a singularity. They use the word singularity today in science a lot. Singularity. So there's a singularity in Shabbos and a singularity in the Jewish people, a certain sanctity, a uniqueness. And then God brings them together, so not that they compromise, that uniqueness is lost, but then they join together to do something unique, to make a mark in this world. Do you think that the people that paved and pioneered a new path were not lonely people? They were probably the loneliest in history. Because when they came to others and said, I have an idea, what do you think happened? They were either mocked, dismissed, blacklisted, excommunicated. That's how it is. We live in a world of conformity, of a certain type of, I would say even a miserable conformity. But people do not want something different. For some people it's very threatening, because if you're doing something unique, what's with me? It exposes that I'm not unique, or I'm not doing anything unique. So that's why people like Abraham, who was the first pioneer, they were vilified. They were criticized. They were even attempted to kill them. They were a threat. I mean, the way they put it, a threat to the system. The former Soviet Union loved to call it counter-revolutionary activity. Anything that didn't fit their model. And you'll see in communities, whether it's the Salem witch hunts in the 18th century, 17th century, I should say, or other witch hunts throughout history, the threat, you're a threat to the communal good. So no person who's ever done anything that's worth talking about did not feel alone at some point. Because that's precisely what they came to contribute, something unique. That's what makes them special. So many of us will say, you know what, I don't have that strength. I can't deal with that. I can't deal with someone laughing at me or mocking me, and maybe they're right. Maybe I don't have anything to contribute. But those that do it don't care. They're not affected by this type of dismissal. And maybe if they are affected, they actually will not achieve something great and unique. What the Torah tells us is, Judaism teaches us, that every one of us can and should be a pioneer. But you need courage to be a pioneer. It's much easier to just walk the path, what they call the way of all flesh. Right? Robert Frost's words, to take the road more traveled on. It's not easy to take the road less traveled. But that makes all the difference, as he puts it. Because taking the road less traveled is taking your unique path. Now, if you have the healthy confidence and nurturing that a good childhood should give you, it makes it a lot easier. Not that it's automatic. I see many people have fine childhoods, but then they go into the world and they become very uncomfortable to try something different because they don't want to stand out. Interestingly, people who sometimes come from dysfunctional homes or homes that are not very healthy, they end up actually doing something more unique than people who grew up in healthy homes. You know why? Because their loneliness, their miserable loneliness, they learn to turn into something special. If you read Steve Jobs' story, you see that. And some people say the same thing even about Bill Clinton, who never saw his father. So they could be very destructive on one hand and very negative. But often you'll find people like that do achieve something that others don't achieve because they're never in their comfort zone. Now, I don't wish it upon anyone, but you see how uniqueness in pain can end up becoming uniqueness in innovation. Some people argue that most of the greatest inventions in history came out of pain. Someone lost something, someone was disturbed, some trauma shook the status quo up, and that created something new. I don't know if that's always the case. It's a good argument to be made for that, because even in the Jewish history, it's after the Jews left Egypt that they received the Torah, and it's often after the darkness where they reached the greatest heights. As they were oppressed, they became more powerful, and they flourished and blossomed. But it's not exclusive just to have a negative experience. In many ways, we do speak about the 3 weeks this way. We say that these 3 weeks, though they're the saddest day in the calendar, they will become the greatest holidays when Mashiach comes. The Medrash, it says, the greatest holiday will be Tisha B'Av. Because in the darkest lies the greatest power, when it's revealed. And we say, Yehafcha Yom Melu, these days will be transformed into the Yom Tov, the Sasna, the Simcha, the Moedim Tov. These days will be transformed to joy and celebration and to great and good holidays. But we don't need to wait necessarily for a negative, even though that could be a catalyst. We have the ability to recognize that when you feel lonely, you have to learn how healthy people deal with loneliness, and that is they look for the uniqueness. There's something unique. And when you find the unique, it becomes a productive force, not a demoralizing force. Now, this isn't easy to do. That's why you need to have good models and know how to talk to people who can help a person get through the darker moments or the lonelier moments. And since we're talking about marriage, it's a good example. At the end of the day, an excellent marriage, as I said before, doesn't mean two people have to understand everything about each other. It's that they embrace each other even if they don't understand everything. That's the beauty of it. And they realize that I become greater and more transcendent when it's not me, because the other person teaches me things that I cannot figure out on my own. It's appreciating the uniqueness of the other. So it's two individual people with many things in common, with much love, but also there's an element that remains elusive that is also part of the relationship. And that elusive element, just like you need love, affection, intimacy, and closeness, you also need the respect of boundaries and the space. The respect that the other person has something you don't have and you have something they don't have. And that may be lonely. That may be a little alone. Some people who are immature will say, I want a partner that understands everything, understands me completely. I can speak about everything with them. Now, hopefully, you don't have any defenses up and you should try to speak, but you think no one will ever get you completely. There's no such thing. It's an immature and unrealistic expectation. You want someone to embrace you even if they don't get you completely. That's the whole part of it. Because even yourself, do you get yourself completely? Can you go into the deepest part of your own soul and say, I really get it? No, you just accept it because it's you. Because there are things that are inexpressible. There are things that we're not even conscious of. There are things that just make us what Hasidic thought calls etzem. Your etzem. Your etzem is by definition not expressible. There are things you can express. You can express deep things, deep feelings, deep passions, deep desires. But there's a part of you that even is lonely even to yourself because you can't even get in touch with it. That doesn't make it less of that doesn't make it what's the word? That's not to be seen as a negative. That's a positive. That's part of realizing the mystique of life. And yes, a certain element of loneliness. As I said, even God. In the Kabbalistic thought, there's an expression from the Zohar that says there's a level called Atik. Atik is considered like the highest level in the divine unconscious, super consciousness. So, you're familiar with the 10 spheres. So the 10 spheres are conscious faculties, 3 intellectual and 7 emotional. But then you get to a place called Keser. Keser is called the crown. Now Keser doesn't mean necessarily a physical crown. It means it's above the head. It's like a crown that we'll call it the more transcendent dimension of experience, or super conscious. Now in the transcendent and super conscious itself, there are 2 levels. There's Arich and Atik. I'll explain in a moment. Let me go back to the soul. As we know, you may know, I've talked about this a number of times, that the soul has 5 dimensions or 5 names. 5 dimensions. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechida. Nefesh is the biological life, which means basically what makes us biologically, medically alive. The life force. Ruach is our emotional life, conscious emotions. So one would be Nehi or Malchus. Chagas, Chesed, Gvur, the first would be Ruach. And Chabad, Chochmah, Bina, Das, the intellectual, is Neshama. So you have Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama. But then you have the next 2 names, Chaya and Yechida. So they correspond to the 2 levels of the transcendent or the super conscious Keser, Arich and Atik. We pray every day 3 prayers a day. On Shabbos and holidays we pray 4 prayers. Yom Kippur, once a year, we pray 5 times. Ne'ilah. They correspond 3 times. The regular weekday, we can access the conscious. Shabbos and Musaf and holidays, you can access the super conscious, the lower level of the super. And Yom Kippur, Yechida, Achaz Bashana, once a year, we can access the innermost dimension of the soul. But even that, as Hasidic thought explains, are still 5 names that the soul is called. The soul itself is even beyond the transcendent. Okay? So, in Atik itself, the Kabbalah says, if you don't follow this, it's all right. The rest of the class is still valid. This is just, I'm going on a deeper level a bit. So it says there's a thing called Radla. It's an acronym for Reisha de Lo Yisyada. The head that's unknown, the unknown head. And the Arizal, explaining the Zohar, says, Lo Yisyada means not Lo Yoda. Lo Yisyada, Lo Yoda, that even he himself doesn't know it. So there's a state that I may know my own secret, But you don't know it because I haven't revealed it to you. But there's a state where I don't even know my own secret. And he refers to God, that highest dimension of the divine experience, as that state. Now what does that mean? He doesn't know it. Because knowledge itself, perception and consciousness and awareness is itself already a lower level. Who says being aware of something is the highest level? Awareness already identifies and says it has parameters. Parameters that you're aware of. Which is why God told Moses, no man can see me and live. Why? Because once you experience the essence, you can't be you. So there's a state of essence that is beyond any form of expression, even to yourself. That's why the deepest part of who you are, you can't even express, not to others and not to yourself. Not because you're holding it back, because it just doesn't have words. It's inexpressible. Can you tell me what life feels like? Tell me what it feels like to be alive. Can you explain it? As soon as you start expressing and explaining what it feels like, you probably need a doctor. Because health doesn't feel like anything. What does it feel like to breathe seamlessly? Someone say, what does it feel like to exist? There are no real words. You could say, well, I'm breathing, I'm walking, but that's what you're doing. Those are functions. What does it feel like to exist? So there are things that are beyond sensation that you can't really describe. That doesn't make them less real. It just means it's beyond description. So there's the expression, even to himself he doesn't know. Then God so-called manifests on a level where he becomes aware of his own experience, so to speak. And then it goes down level by level by level to the point of consciousness as we relate to it. The point being is that state is what we call loneliness in a negative way. The highest state of badad, complete uniqueness, is so unique that it has no form of expression. And when you get in touch with another person, when there's real love, you connect to the other person without needing to express it. It's there without any words. It does not need to be explained. It does not need to be rationalized. It does not need to be understood. And that doesn't make it less of a connection. I would say it's a deeper connection. Anyone that has children knows that the connection you have in the core level to your children is not connected to explanations. Your child can cause you a lot of aggravation, God forbid, but the fundamental connection, for a healthy person at least, to their child is always there no matter what. It has nothing to do with what you feel. Of course, you'd love to have nachas and enjoy your children and only see good things. But there are certain fundamental connections that defy description and defy the experience. Even if it's not a positive, the connection is there. You can never disconnect from that. And even the good times, is that what defines your connection to someone you love, just because things are going well? That's a beautiful way to manifest it. But that's not what the connection, it's not conditional based on, you know what, I'll love you when you make me feel good. That's not a essential love. That's a love, which means it's conditional. And when you don't make me feel good, I don't love you, so that's not that. That's a love, that's like a business transaction. You do this for me, then I'll connect it to you. You don't do it, I'm not committed. The guy told me, I said, do you have unconditional love to your wife? He says, yeah, if she did this and this and that and that and that, I'd have unconditional love for her. You know? And he didn't even realize what he said. You know, that's like the guy that goes on the date and talks about himself for 2 hours. And then he turns to the girl and says, okay, enough about me. Now, what do you think about me? And he sees that as being like benevolent. He's giving her now equal time to speak about him. So basically it's two forms of narcissism. One is narcissism, I talk about myself. The second state is now you talk about me. Is there a third, anything more than that? Okay. You know, as they say, a Kopf kann nicht aufstellen, right? You can't, if someone doesn't get it, you can't explain this to them, right? Either you get it, you don't get it. So, my friends, I'm here to tell you is that we're not alone, and there is someone that cares. However, the care can take on different shapes. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't see it. The Baal Shem Tov uses the classic example of what Yiddish is called Schwindeltreppe, spiral staircase. Why is it called Schwindel? Schwindel in Yiddish is swindling, like a swindler. Because a regular staircase, as far as it is, you see the destination. A spiral case swindles you into thinking that you're not reaching your destination. As you climb higher, you have to keep turning. Right before the pinnacle, your back is turned to the destination. You can convince yourself There's no destination. No one's there. But it could be it's right there, but you're not seeing it. So yes, we're told and we know and we believe and we see it in Jewish history. There's no way we would have survived it all if someone didn't care. And it's critical to know that someone cares. The question is how that care manifests. Now we want that care to be revealed and we could see it. But never think it's not there. And it's not about giving up on God, it's giving up on yourself. Your soul is always there. Ani yeshena, I may be asleep. V'li be'er, your heart is awake. My heart is awake. Your soul is always there. It's like always a pulsating force waiting to be released. And we need to have that total confidence and therefore know that loneliness in the negative sense is not our state of being. On the contrary, if anything, it's a tool to discover uniqueness and discover something powerful that you can bring to this world and pioneer. And yet we still ask that we shouldn't be it shouldn't be concealed. We still ask for the revelation, Yor Hashem Peinecho, to see it in a revealed way. But that doesn't mean that it's not there. I mean, I can't resist, but there's that greeting card, I don't know, that poem, whatever, it became very popular, but I think it's taken straight from Jewish sources, you know, where life is like these two sets of footprints in the sand. And so it's like the person walking and God walking alongside, beside you your entire life. And then suddenly the two sets of footsteps become one set of footsteps. And when you realize that section of your life, that period of your life was the life when you felt all alone and desolate. So the person turns to God and says, you walked side by side me my whole life. Why, when there's the most darkest moments, you let me walk alone? So God said, you didn't walk alone. Those are my footsteps that I was walking and carrying you on my shoulders. But you see only one set of footsteps. When someone carries you on your shoulders, you can't see them. When they walk near you, you could see them. So which is a stronger connection? So when you look at life and you see people who've survived the most horrible situations, difficult, that is where you see God more than anywhere else. Now, we shouldn't have to rely on that. I wish we didn't have to rely on that. But when people tell you that they found strength in the darkest moments, that strength, where did it come from? Because someone cared. There's something working inside of us that works and helps us heal. And I'll just give you one example that I use, which is actually a very, I have mixed feelings when I share it always, because it's so painful on one hand, but it's so miraculous on another. But I have to share it because it's really strong stuff. So I remember my earlier years, first being exposed to some of the darkness of life by people who shared with me things that I couldn't even believe are possible. You know, I grew up, no home is perfect, but I can tell you I never believed certain abuse, certain horror even, that happened in people's homes. And without going into detail, it's not for now, but I remember hearing about real abuse, and then reading about it, I became very intrigued, not just from curious, but simply to know how to respond to people. And people coming to me, they thought I could help. I couldn't even identify with what they're talking about. First, I didn't even believe it's possible. I mean, I believed them, but I meant to say it was completely beyond my framework of experience. So I went to read, and I started reading a lot about the different, what happens to children who grow up in very abusive homes. And there's the concept of the out-of-body experience, that people who suffer repeated abuse, repeated violation one way or another, at some point they go out of body because it's so intolerable for them to experience it that they just block it out, and it's as if it's happening to someone else. And to the point it could actually create a split personality type, almost like two identities. The one that was abused, and there's me. And they grow up with a whole new persona, and that inner child that some people call goes undercover because it does not want to deal with the pain that it's just too painful, too impossible to tolerate and handle. So they create another part of themselves, and it's like an out-of-body thing. And when you read about it the first time, if you're not familiar with this, it may sound strange and weird, but those of you familiar know this is real. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen people who have experienced it, and people who have sustained the experience, and people who have come to find and reconnect Because the healing comes to reconnect and tell the child and you, now it's safe, you can come out. We can reconnect. So basically their so-called superimposed personality makes peace with the real personality that went undercover and hiding, so to speak. So I always thought about it and came to realize, I don't know, I coined it a type of psychological hypothermia. You know, hypothermia is, especially children for some reason fall under, let's say, fall into ice cold water. That's under, it's walking on a frozen lake. God forbid they fall in. So there was a time where some people were declared dead. Then they came to realize, because all the vital signs were not there, not even the heartbeat, nothing. Then they realize it's not true. They are not dead. What happens is that the body, to preserve itself, goes into such shock. In order to preserve life, it shuts everything down, but there's something still there. It's called hypothermia. And that if you bring the child back to the right warmth and so on, you can revive. So you think about it, on one hand, of course, it's a terrible thing, but in a way, a God-given power inside the human being to realize, to save life, you have to shut everything down. To preserve that little energy left, because it was freezing cold, would kill the child. So I thought to myself that it's similar to the psychological phenomenon, where a person is in such a difficult situation that everything has to shut off. To preserve themselves, they have to literally leave their body until the place when they get safe, and then they have to find a way to reconnect. So then I came to, and I related it to an interesting letter that Rambam, Maimonides, writes to Rabbi Avadia Hager. Avadia Hager was a convert. He was a great sage, but he was a convert to Judaism. And he once wrote to the Rambam a very sad letter, bemoaning his own state. He says, look, with all that I've achieved, I'll always be a stranger. Because I don't have the lineage, the yichus, that the born Jew has, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. That's what he writes to the Rambam. And the Rambam writes back to him, very powerful letter, but one key thing he writes to him, he said to him, on the contrary, because you converted and connect, you don't need to go through the intermediaries of the human beings called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You have direct lineage straight to Misha Amar V'Haya Elam, to the Creator of God, without any wires. You have like a direct express connection. I'm using that expression. So I thought to myself, and Maimonides wasn't just being patronizing, and he wasn't trying to be cute, that psychologically, when a person who's, for whatever reason, their dignity was stolen from them, and they did not have the luxury of growing up in a home where they deserve that every human being deserves the love and validation and respect that I was talking about before. They have, when they find their connection, they have a connection straight to God Himself that even their parents can't get in the way of. And that ultimately is where the real healing comes. So, on one hand, it's of course very sad to talk about, but as I said, it's miraculous in a way. And I say it because that's why sometimes you'll find the darkest moments, talk about loneliness, when converted and transformed properly, can lead a person to the highest points of connection to the loneliness of God Himself, the uniqueness and essence of God. The God that's called, what do I say, Ach uben Enle, what's the expression? The divine that does not have any type of human lineage. So Cantor Malavani, Joseph Malavani is the cantor many years in the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. So I saw a video of him going by the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he tells the Rebbe in Yiddish, he says that they're going to London, where their son has a very severe case of autism. He was already an adult by now. And he said very severe, that he had to literally be put in a home because it's an extreme case of autism. And he's asked for a blessing. So the Rebbe tells him, they say that autistic children don't have a relationship with other people. But they don't realize that with other people they don't have a relationship, but they have a direct relationship with God. Basically suggesting that people don't get in the way. It's direct to God. Our relationship to God is usually through people. And the Kantor Malavani tells the Rebbe it's true that when it comes to his Dalet Kampf, his tzitzis, he like has a particular passion about tzitzis. So the Rebbe suggests he should put a charity box in his room and so on. But I found it to be fascinating. You know, obviously, everyone should be blessed with healthy children. But to be able to see that there's sometimes someone may be lacking something on one level, on a conscious level, but to be able to see that their connection in some ways is even deeper than other people's connection, you know, that takes the real eyes of obviously that looks beyond the superficial. And that there are connections we can't always understand. So even here, that type of extreme situation. But let me sum up here and conclude with the loneliness discussion. So in these 3 weeks of desolate loneliness, we talk about it openly, we're not afraid to talk about it. We discuss and realize that even when we have these moments, they don't define you. And that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So the fact that you can acknowledge it and be aware of it is the beginning of every healing. And ultimately realize that every loneliness has a positive side to it. It really originates from the uniqueness of the divine itself that's beyond any form of connection. And this is a common theme in Hasidic thought, especially in Chabad Hasidic thought, where we talk about, let's say, the midbar, the wilderness, is a place lo yoshev adam sham, which means a wilderness is not a place where civilized people live. So the Baal HaTanya, the Alter Rebbe says, but it's also a place on the other side, it's beyond where people live. It's higher than human. So even things that seem lower, subhuman, or in a negative sense, originate sometimes from a positive force which is beyond the human. So may we all convert our darker, shadowy moments into great black holes of powerful light, and hold on strong to your connections and to people who have forged paths. It's always good to be around pioneers and people who have the courage and are fearless in this journey. And we can turn these lonely days into great days of joy and celebration. So there's something to be said about a communing like this, like we do here, a type of kindred spirits connecting, souls connecting, because at the end of the day, even if each one of us goes and have our own unique paths and lonely paths maybe, but there's something that connects us all. We all know we're on a common journey, a common great symphony that we have to play, and each one plays our particular note and our particular instrument, and we know that even though you play your instrument, I play mine, but in some way we join together, and I need yours as much as you need mine. So with that, everyone should have a very blessed week, revealed blessings. Mazel tov again to you. And until next Wednesday, everyone have a very good week, and please stay in touch through email. Leave me your email address. I've been broadcasting now for the last few weeks on Facebook Live. There's this new thing, Facebook Live. So if you're listening or watching this, please like it or share it, comment, post it, whatever, all the different, I don't even know all the verbs that they use today. And if I can be of any help in your lonely journey, and if you could help me in mine, that's how we celebrate together. Be well, everybody. Bye-bye.